Morgoth stood on the precipice of creation, once the brightest and most revered of the Aenir. His voice had woven melodies that shaped the cosmos, and his light had been a beacon of inspiration. Yet, beneath this brilliance festered a hunger, a desire not for harmony, but for dominion. Where the others sang to enrich the song of Eru Iluvatar, Morgoth sought to bend it, twist it, make it his own. It was not enough to be part of the symphony, he craved to be its master. When he first struck his discordant notes, the echoes were subtle. The Aenir paused, sensing the ripple of unease that coursed through their harmonious creation. It was a sound of defiance, a challenge to the beauty they had crafted together. But Morgoth reveled in this chaos, and his power swelled. The music of the Aenir, meant to be flawless, now bore scars of his rebellion. And from these scars, a shadow began to grow. In the beginning, Middle-earth bore the light of innocence. Its forests sang with the laughter of newborn rivers, and its skies shimmered with the untouched glow of starlight. The world was pure, unspoiled. Morgoth entered it not as a conqueror but as a corrupter, his influence subtle yet insidious. He whispered to the mountains, urging them to rise jagged and menacing. He stirred the seas to rage, their once gentle waves now capable of swallowing ships whole. Where there had been peace, he planted seeds of unrest, and those seeds took root in the hearts of the unwary. Yet his hunger remained unsatisfied. Morgoth wanted more than to bend the land, he sought to break its spirit. He turned his gaze to the children of Iluvatar, the elves, so radiant and filled with potential. Morgoth's charm, when he chose to wield it, was irresistible. He offered gifts cloaked in deceit, promises wrapped in poison. His words were honeyed, his intent venomous. The first of the captured elves saw the truth too late. Under Morgoth's hand, their beauty became grotesque, their light extinguished. Thus were born the orcs, creatures of anguish and shadow, whose very existence was a mockery of their once glorious origins. Morgoth's thirst for destruction birthed horrors beyond imagining. Dragons, with their fiery breath and impenetrable scales, emerged from his forges, their roars shaking the earth. Trolls, brutish and cruel, became the guardians of his dark places. But even these creations failed to satiate his desires. Morgoth longed for a creature that could carry his will with cunning and elegance, a being that would embody his own twisted grandeur. It was in this yearning that the vampiric horrors were born. The first vampires were not mindless beasts, but beings of dreadful allure. Morgoth shaped them from the essence of shadow itself, giving them a form both beautiful and terrible. Their eyes burned like coals in the dark, and their voices could charm even the most steadfast heart. But it was their hunger that defined them, a hunger not just for blood but for the light of life itself. A single touch from these creatures could drain the vitality from their prey, leaving behind hollow shells. These vampires were Morgoth's whispers incarnate. They moved in silence, their presence heralded only by the shiver that ran down a spine or the flicker of a shadow where none should be. Morgoth did not unleash them en masse, they were his secret weapon, sent to sow fear and discord where his armies could not reach. They thrived in the edges of the world, and places forgotten by starlight. Their power was drawn from the darkness that Morgoth wove into the fabric of the world. He had corrupted not just the physical land, but the very essence of existence. Shadows clung to his creations, alive and writhing, as though desperate to consume any light they encountered. The vampires carried this essence within them, making them creatures of unmatched terror. Among them, there were whispers of a queen, a figure of unparalleled strength and beauty. Thuringwethil, Morgoth's herald, was said to have wings like a bat and a voice that could pierce the soul. Her presence turned the bravest warriors to cowards, and her laughter was a song of despair. She was not merely a servant, she was an extension of Morgoth's will, a living embodiment of his cruelty and ambition. The fear of these creatures spread like wildfire. Elves, the firstborn, shuddered at the thought of vampires stalking their hidden sanctuaries. Men whispered tales of shadows that could not be escaped, of loved ones who vanished only to return as hollow-eyed predators. These stories grew with each retelling, the line between myth and reality blurring until the vampires became legends of terror. But Morgoth's darkness was not contained. It seeped into the very core of Middle-earth, tainting all it touched. Rivers grew cold and lifeless, their waters reflecting not the stars, but a black void. Forests, once alive with song, fell silent, their trees twisted into grotesque shapes. Even the air carried the weight of his malice, suffocating and thick with despair. The light of the Vala struggled to pierce this veil. The elves, with their ancient wisdom, sought to counter Morgoth's creations with their own works of beauty and power, but the damage was done. Morgoth had proven that even the brightest light could cast a shadow, and in that shadow, he thrived. Morgoth's vampires were not merely creatures of the night, they were harbingers of his philosophy. They existed to remind the world that darkness could not be banished, only endured. Each of them carried a fragment of his essence, a piece of the hatred and ambition that had driven him to rebellion. Through them, Morgoth's shadow would linger, long after his defeat, haunting the edges of the world and the corners of memory. Yet, even in the midst of this darkness, there were whispers of resistance. The elves and men did not yield completely to despair. They spoke of heroes who dared to face the night, who sought to reclaim what Morgoth had stolen. These whispers, faint and fragile, hinted at a light that could never be fully extinguished. But for now, the darkness reigned, and the vampires of Morgoth carried its banner, their eyes gleaming with the fire of a hatred as old as the stars themselves. And as the shadows lengthened, their story intertwined with another, one of defiance, love, and a stolen fate that would challenge even the blackest of nights. The silence in Unveil was unlike any other. It was not the absence of sound, but a suffocating void that pressed against the mind and soul. Within those blackened halls, where shadows seemed to writhe and cling to the walls, Morgoth's experiments began. Here, the screams of the unwilling mingled with the cold laughter of their tormentor. Morgoth thrived on that agony. It was the music he preferred, the discordant echoes of lives breaking under his touch. Elves were his first canvas. Their beauty, their purity, it offended him. To Morgoth, they were a reminder of the harmony he had rejected, and he sought to defile them in ways that would taint their very essence. He captured the brightest among them, those whose light shone as starlight in the dark. He chained them in his forges, their cries drowned by the roar of molten fire. Through pain and despair, he poured his will into them, bending their bodies and spirits to his dark designs. These captives were not meant to die quickly. Morgoth prolonged their suffering, watching as their fair forms twisted into grotesque shadows of what they once were. Eyes that once sparkled with the light of Valinor dimmed, replaced by a predatory glow. Their grace became a haunting stillness, their voices a siren song meant to lure the unwary. From these experiments, the first vampiric entities emerged, creatures of cunning and cruelty. Unlike orcs, who were brutish and mindless, these beings retained an eerie intelligence. They were Morgoth's answer to the light of the elves. He turned their beauty into a weapon, their allure into a trap. They could walk among their prey, blending in, their true nature hidden until it was too late. They didn't just kill, they consumed. Life, hope, light, all of it drained away with their touch. Where they walked, only emptiness remained. Men were next. Unlike the elves, men were frail, their lives fleeting. But their mortality intrigued Morgoth. He found a certain poetry in their brief existence, a spark he could extinguish with ease. His experiments on men were no less horrifying. He used their fear of death against them, promising them immortality while twisting their bodies and minds into monstrous forms. The vampiric creations born from men were savage, driven by hunger that could never be sated. They were bound to Morgoth's will, their lives an endless torment of servitude and insatiable thirst. These vampiric entities were not created for mere chaos. Morgoth saw their potential as weapons of war, tools to spread terror in the hearts of those who opposed him. In battle, they were devastating. Unlike orcs and trolls, who relied on brute strength, these creatures used stealth and guile. They moved through the shadows, striking without warning. They targeted leaders, sowed discord among ranks, and turned allies against one another. Morgoth unleashed them in the dead of night, their victims often unaware of the danger until it was too late. Their role in Morgoth's armies was unique. Orcs were expendable, mindless hordes that could be replaced. Trolls were instruments of destruction, their purpose limited to smashing and tearing. But the vampires, oh, they were something else entirely. Morgoth valued them not for their numbers, but for their ability to instill fear. They were his spies, his assassins, his instruments of psychological warfare. A single vampire could devastate an entire village without lifting a weapon, simply by turning neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend. Even among Morgoth's servants, the vampires were feared. Orcs whispered about them in hushed tones, refusing to meet their gaze. Trolls, simple-minded as they were, shied away from the vampire's presence, sensing something unnatural in their essence. The vampires stood apart, their elegance and intelligence making them seem almost otherworldly, even to those who shared their dark allegiance. Morgoth delighted in this division, for it ensured that his creations would never unite against him. But there was something else, something unspoken, that set these vampires apart. In their eyes burned the faintest flicker of what they had once been. It was a cruel reminder of their origins, a trace of the light they had lost. Morgoth saw to it that this spark remained, for it was the source of their torment. They could never escape their hunger, never reclaim what had been stolen from them. Their existence was a cycle of longing and despair, and Morgoth reveled in their suffering. As Morgoth's shadow stretched across Middle-earth, the vampires became an enduring symbol of his power. They embodied his hatred, his cunning, his desire to corrupt and control. They were the perfect instruments of his will, and yet, in their very perfection lay the seeds of their tragedy. For even in the darkest night, there is a glimmer of resistance, a whisper of defiance that cannot be silenced. And in the hearts of these shadow spawn, buried beneath layers of darkness, there lingered the faintest echo of what they had once been. The air grew colder as the sun sank beneath the jagged peaks of Thangorodrim. A faint rustling, like the whisper of dry leaves, cut through the oppressive silence. She was coming. The shadows themselves seemed to recoil, curling inward as if unwilling to touch the presence that approached. Thuringwethil, the mistress of shadows, had arrived, and even the creatures of Morgoth's dominion trembled in her wake. Her origins were shrouded in secrecy, whispered in hushed tones by those who dared to speak of her. Once, perhaps, she had been something pure, a Maya, a being of light who wandered the vast expanse of the world in its youth. But Morgoth's lure was insidious, and she fell, seduced by promises of power and freedom from the constraints of virtue. If she had resisted, her defiance had been crushed, for what emerged from her fall was not light dimmed, but a darkness so consuming it became its own force. Morgoth himself shaped her, twisting her essence until it mirrored his malice. Her beauty, once radiant, now held a terrible allure. She was tall and lithe, her movements a deadly dance of grace and menace. Her wings, vast and leathery, stretched wide like the night itself, blotting out the stars. Her eyes burned with a predatory glow, piercing and unrelenting, and her voice carried the weight of promises too dangerous to resist. But it was not her appearance that struck terror into the hearts of even the bravest. It was her presence, an overwhelming aura of despair that clung to her like a shroud. When she entered a room, hope fled. Courage crumbled. It was as though she carried with her the very essence of fear, a palpable force that suffocated all who dared to stand in her path. Thuringwethil was no mere servant. Morgoth had given her a role that suited her talents, and she rose to it with chilling perfection. She was his herald, his enforcer, the voice that carried his dark will across Middle-earth. Where she traveled, ruin followed. Villages were abandoned, their inhabitants either slaughtered or driven mad by the mere thought of her approach. Armies faltered, their strength sapped by the whispers of her coming. Her abilities were as vast as they were horrifying. Thuringwethil could shift her form at will, a shadow slipping between cracks, a monstrous bat soaring across the skies. Her keen senses allowed her to hear the faintest whisper, to see through the densest darkness. But her true power lay in her mind. She could ensnare thoughts, twist them until her victims no longer knew truth from lies. To meet her gaze was to confront one's worst fears, magnified and given form. In the service of Morgoth, she became his most trusted messenger. She carried his commands to his generals, ensuring that his will was enacted with ruthless precision. She bore tidings of despair to his enemies, often accompanied by a demonstration of her power. Her wings would darken the sky, her voice echoing like a dirge as she delivered Morgoth's ultimatums. Those who defied her were left broken, their spirits shattered long before the armies of Unveil arrived. But Thuringwethil was more than a messenger, she was a weapon. When Morgoth required subtlety, she was the knife in the dark, slipping through enemy lines to sow discord and fear. Her victims often never saw her coming, their last moments filled with confusion and terror. Even among Morgoth's other creations, she was unique. Orcs and trolls feared her, sensing the boundless malice that emanated from her. The Balrogs, with all their fire and fury, treated her with a respect born of caution. She operated alone, answering only to Morgoth himself. There were whispers that she fed not just on blood, as did other vampiric creatures, but on the very essence of life. Those who crossed her path were left hollow, their vitality drained away, leaving behind husks devoid of joy or strength. This was her gift, and her curse, an unending hunger that drove her to consume even as it isolated her. To her, existence was not life but survival, an eternal cycle of taking to fill a void that could never be satisfied. And yet, there were moments, fleeting, buried deep beneath layers of malice, where her actions betrayed a flicker of something more. A hesitation, a glance too long, a sigh that spoke of longing for a time before she had become what she was. These moments were rare, almost imperceptible, but they hinted at a complexity that few dared to acknowledge. Was she entirely lost to the darkness, or did some fragment of what she once was still endure, buried beneath the weight of Morgoth's will? Thuringwethil's legend grew with each passing year, her name whispered in fear across the lands. Mothers told their children tales of the winged shadow that would come for them if they strayed too far at night. Warriors prayed for courage to face her, though none truly believed they could withstand her power. Her presence became synonymous with doom, her shadow a harbinger of despair. And yet, her story was far from over. In the endless struggle between light and darkness, she remained a force to be reckoned with, a reminder of the price of defiance against the will of the Vala. Her role in the grand design was not one of redemption, but of torment, a reflection of the choices that led to her fall and the consequences that rippled through the ages. It began with a whisper, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The air thickened, heavy with an unspoken dread, as if the very world held its breath. And then the scream came, raw and primal, tearing through the silence like a blade through flesh. It wasn't the scream of pain alone, it was the sound of a soul breaking, of something being taken that could never be returned. They called it the blood curse, but those who bore it knew it by another name, damnation. It was not a wound inflicted with sword or claw, but an insidious corruption, a shadow that seeped into the very essence of a being. To witness the transformation was to see life turned inside out, beauty twisted into horror, and hope extinguished in a tide of unrelenting hunger. The process began with the bite. It was not always forced, sometimes it was accepted, whispered promises of eternal strength or freedom luring the desperate into the jaws of darkness. The bite was not merely a wound, it was a gateway. Morgoth's dark magic infused the act, binding the victim to a fate that was neither life nor death. Blood, laced with his corruption, carried the curse deeper, wrapping itself around the soul like chains forged in shadow. For those who resisted, the transformation was a nightmare of defiance and despair. Their bodies fought against the dark magic, a futile battle that left them writhing in agony as veins burned like fire and hearts pounded with unnatural force. Eyes, once bright, clouded over, turning red with a predatory gleam. Teeth elongated, sharp and cruel, tools of a hunger that would never be sated. But the physical pain was nothing compared to what came next. The newly turned would wake to silence, but it was not the absence of sound. It was a void, an all-encompassing emptiness that consumed everything. They could feel it in their chest, a hollowness where their heart once beat freely. The hunger came slowly at first, a gnawing ache that built with every passing moment until it became unbearable. And then the realization struck, the only cure for the hunger was blood. The act of feeding was more than survival, it was a ritual, steeped in the black magic that tied the curse to their creator. It was not simply drinking but an exchange, a siphoning of life force that left the victim drained of far more than blood. Those who were fed upon experienced a terror that defied description. Their memories, their joys, their very essence seemed to slip away, consumed by the one who had claimed them. For the cursed, the act of feeding brought both relief and torment. The hunger receded, but only for a time, and the guilt lingered. Each life taken weighed heavily, yet the pull of the curse was stronger than any regret. They could not resist, no matter how hard they tried. The more they fed, the more they changed, their humanity slipping further away with every drop of blood consumed. And yet, there were some who embraced the curse, who saw it not as a punishment but as a gift. They reveled in their newfound strength, their heightened senses, their immortality. They became hunters, predators who thrived on the fear and suffering of their prey. For these, the transformation was not a curse but a choice, a willing surrender to the darkness that offered them power beyond imagination. But even for the willing, the cost was steep. The dark magic that sustained them did more than alter their bodies, it twisted their minds. The newly turned often found themselves haunted by visions, memories of their past lives corrupted by Morgoth's influence. They saw the faces of those they had loved, distorted and accusing, their voices echoing in their ears long after the feeding was done. The line between reality and nightmare blurred until it became impossible to distinguish one from the other. For the victims, the curse did not always end with death. Some were left alive, broken and hollow, their minds shattered by the experience. They spoke of shadows that moved when no one else saw them, of voices that whispered promises and threats in the darkness. They carried the marks of the bite like brands, reminders of the moment their lives were stolen from them. And for some, the curse took root, spreading through their veins until they, too, became creatures of the night. The blood curse was not simply an act of transformation, it was a ripple that extended outward, touching everything and everyone it came into contact with. Families were torn apart, communities left in ruins as the cursed brought their hunger to bear on the innocent. The land itself seemed to wither in their wake, the very air growing cold and lifeless. And always, the shadow of Morgoth loomed, his dark will driving the curse forward, ensuring that its reach would never be confined. But the curse was not without its cracks. Among the cursed, there were whispers of resistance, of those who fought against the hunger, who sought to hold onto some fragment of their former selves. Their struggle was quiet, unseen by most, but it was a flicker of light in a sea of darkness. Whether they could ever truly overcome the curse was a question left unanswered, but their defiance, however small, was a testament to the resilience of the soul. The shadow of the curse stretched long, its tendrils creeping into every corner of Middle-earth. Its victims, its perpetrators, its witnesses, all bore the weight of its influence. And yet, in the darkest corners, where the whispers of Morgoth's will were strongest, there was still a spark of something more. Something that hinted at what might yet come. The shadows stirred with a sinister rhythm, as if the night itself held its breath, waiting for an unspoken command. In the silence, a figure emerged, not wholly seen, but felt, like a chill that sank deep into the bones. It wasn't Sauron's physical presence that caused the air to grow heavy, it was his will. His power moved like a dark tide, pulling everything beneath its crushing weight. And among those who knelt to his might were the vampires, creatures bound to the shadow through blood and dark magic, each a weapon forged to spread his terror. Sauron, the lieutenant of Morgoth, inherited not only his master's ambition but also the tools of his corruption. He understood the nature of control, how fear could bend even the strongest wills. Vampires, with their insatiable hunger and cursed existence, were perfect instruments for his designs. They were not mere beasts, but thinking creatures, capable of subtlety and cunning, and Sauron used that to his advantage. They could blend into the dark corners of Middle-earth, their presence felt long before they were seen. Under Sauron's command, vampires became more than predators, they became enforcers. While orcs and trolls served as blunt instruments of war, vampires thrived in the shadows, where fear festered and multiplied. Sauron's will flowed through them like venom, binding them to his purpose. They were his spies, his assassins, and his messengers, slipping through the cracks in enemy defenses like a poison that could not be traced. The hierarchy within Sauron's Dark Legion was both brutal and efficient. Orcs were the foot soldiers, countless in number but expendable. Trolls were the battering rams, their strength used to shatter walls and break armies. But vampires held a unique place, neither as numerous as the orcs nor as mindlessly destructive as the trolls. They were trusted with tasks that required precision and silence. Their intelligence and ability to navigate the night made them invaluable, and Sauron rewarded their loyalty with the promise of sustenance and survival, though under his terms. Sauron's bond with the vampires was not one of friendship or mutual respect. It was a chain forged in fear and necessity. He knew the hunger that drove them, how it gnawed at their very being. He used that hunger like a leash, keeping them close but never fully sated. They fed on his command, their victims chosen not by their own desires but by Sauron's designs. In return, he protected them from the wrath of the sun, cloaking their movements in storms and shadows, ensuring they could hunt freely in his name. For the vampires, this alliance was both a curse and a lifeline. To serve Sauron was to forfeit any illusion of freedom, to become a tool in his vast machine of domination. Yet, for many, there was no other choice. Their existence was bound to the darkness, and Sauron's power offered them purpose where once there was only a hollow, aimless thirst. But in their hearts, they knew that loyalty to Sauron was not rewarded with mercy. Failure was met with obliteration, and disobedience was unthinkable. The relationship between vampires and the other dark creatures under Sauron's rule was tense and often volatile. Orcs despised the vampires, seeing them as privileged creatures who shirked the dangers of the battlefield. Trolls, with their limited intellect, viewed them with confusion, unable to grasp their purpose. But the vampires held themselves apart, their pride and cunning elevating them above the petty squabbles of their monstrous peers. They saw the orcs as tools, the trolls as beasts, and themselves as the true servants of Sauron's will. Despite the disdain, there was a grudging respect between the groups. Vampires relied on the brute force of the orcs to create chaos, while the orcs feared the vampires' ability to strike unseen. This uneasy balance was maintained through Sauron's iron hand, his will ensuring that his forces worked as one even when hatred simmered beneath the surface. The tasks Sauron assigned to his vampires were as varied as they were chilling. Some were sent into enemy lands, their silken words and unnatural allure turning hearts against one another. Others were charged with hunting down those who dared defy him, their presence a death sentence whispered on the wind. And then there were those who served as his personal messengers, carrying his commands across vast distances with a speed and secrecy unmatched by any other. The most feared of these was a vampire whose name was spoken only in hushed tones, a harbinger of death whose allegiance to Sauron was absolute. She moved through the night like a phantom, her arrival marked by nothing more than the silence that followed. Her victims were found drained of life, their faces frozen in expressions of unspeakable terror. To hear her name was to know that your time had come, that Sauron's wrath was upon you. Even among Sauron's servants, there was unease surrounding the vampires. They were a constant reminder of Morgoth's legacy, of the power that once threatened to consume all of Middle-earth. Their existence was a living testament to the corruption that lingered, a shadow that refused to be banished. And as they moved through the darkness, spreading fear and death in their wake, it became clear that they were not just servants of Sauron but harbingers of something far more sinister. Their loyalty to Sauron was absolute, but it was not born of love or respect. It was fear that bound them, the knowledge that his power could crush them just as easily as it sustained them. Yet, beneath the surface, there were whispers of discontent, of vampires who questioned their place in Sauron's grand design. They were few and far between, but their existence hinted at cracks in the foundation of Sauron's control. And as the night stretched on, the shadows stirred once more, carrying with them the faintest hint of rebellion. The air was thick with the scent of blood and smoke, and the cries of the dying seemed to echo endlessly across the battlefield. Beneath the pale light of the moon, shadows shifted unnaturally, moving with a speed and precision that no mortal eye could fully track. The armies of the free peoples braced themselves, their hearts pounding as an unearthly chill crept into their bones. They had heard of these creatures, whispers carried by survivors who spoke of battles lost not to swords or strength, but to a darkness that thought, hunted, and thirsted. And then, like the first drop of rain before a storm, the silence was broken. Morgoth's vampires swept onto the battlefield with the force of a nightmare made real. They were not an army that marched, they were a tempest that struck. Moving faster than the eye could follow, they descended upon their foes with a ferocity that defied the limits of flesh and bone. Their pale forms glided through the chaos, leaving only death in their wake. Unlike the orcs or the trolls, who fought with brute force, these creatures were precise. Each movement was calculated, every strike a killing blow. Morgoth had seen their potential, even in the earliest days of their cursed existence. He had shaped them, not through kindness or care, but through domination and fear. They were his instruments of terror, creatures bound to his will and molded to suit his unrelenting hunger for conquest. Where the orcs waged war in overwhelming numbers, and the trolls shattered walls with their brute strength, the vampires played a different role. They were Morgoth's secret weapon, unleashed when darkness alone was not enough to ensure victory. Their strategies were as haunting as their presence. They would descend upon encampments in the dead of night, their silent wings and ghostly forms rendering them almost invisible against the starless skies. No watchman was safe from their touch, no soldier could prepare for the icy grasp of death that came without warning. Their greatest weapon was fear itself, an invisible hand that gripped the hearts of their enemies before the first blow was even struck. Armies faltered not because they lacked strength, but because they were robbed of hope. In open combat, the vampires were an unrelenting force. They struck from the air, their claws tearing through armor as if it were paper. Their speed made them nearly impossible to hit, and their intelligence meant they attacked with precision, targeting leaders and healers first to sow chaos among their enemies. They did not fight to dominate, they fought to destroy, to leave nothing but silence and emptiness where once there was life. Yet, for all their power, they were not without weaknesses. The light of the sun was their greatest enemy, its warmth and radiance burning away the dark magic that sustained them. Morgoth, ever cunning, devised ways to shield them from this vulnerability. He blanketed battlefields with smoke from burning forests and summoned storms so thick that day became night. But even he could not protect them forever. When the sun broke through the clouds, even the mightiest of his vampires were forced to retreat, their flesh smoldering under the relentless light. And then there was their hunger, the endless, gnawing thirst that drove them. While it made them relentless hunters, it also made them dangerous to their allies. When battles dragged on, and their thirst grew unbearable, even Morgoth's own forces were not safe. Orcs would fall to their fangs as easily as any enemy, their screams lost in the cacophony of war. Morgoth cared little for such losses, viewing them as necessary sacrifices, but it was a weakness that could not be ignored. Despite these flaws, the vampires thrived under Morgoth's rule. They were not merely tools, they were symbols of his power, a reminder that even the purest of creatures could be twisted into something monstrous under his influence. Their presence on the battlefield was a testament to his ability to corrupt and destroy, to turn hope into despair and life into death. And so, the vampires became the stuff of legend and terror, their deeds whispered among the free peoples long after the battles were over. Mothers warned their children to stay inside after dark, their voices trembling as they spoke of creatures that could slip through the smallest crack in a door. Warriors who had faced them and lived bore scars that went far deeper than flesh, their eyes haunted by memories of comrades lost to the shadow. The armies of Middle-earth knew that facing Morgoth's forces meant more than clashing with orcs and trolls. It meant facing the unknown, the unnatural, and the utterly terrifying. The vampires were not simply soldiers, they were a manifestation of everything Morgoth stood for: corruption, domination, and the annihilation of light. And yet, even in the darkest corners of fear, there was something else. A question, unspoken but ever-present. Were the vampires truly loyal to Morgoth, or were they simply victims of his will, creatures who had lost themselves in the tide of his darkness? The answer was buried somewhere in the shadows, where the line between monster and victim blurred until it could no longer be seen. The night hung heavy, darker than the depths of any cavern, as though the stars themselves had recoiled from what was about to unfold. The elves of Doriath, keen-eyed and vigilant, stood watch at the borders of their woodland home. Their senses, sharper than those of any mortal, caught the faintest rustle of leaves, the subtlest shift in the air. But even they could not fully prepare for what was creeping closer, cloaked in shadows thicker than any the forest had ever known. The first attack came without warning. A guard fell silently, his cry smothered before it could reach his lips. Another turned, only to catch a fleeting glimpse of pale skin and gleaming eyes before he too was silenced. It was not the noise of battle that alerted the others, but its absence. The stillness, the unnatural quiet, spoke louder than any scream. When the elves finally realized what was happening, the darkness erupted with movement. The vampires moved like whispers, swift and silent. They struck with a precision that defied nature, their claws cutting through the enchanted armor of the Eldar as if it were no more than cloth. For the first time in ages, the elves, who had faced dragons, Balrogs, and Morgoth himself, felt a chill that no fire could warm. These were not mere creatures of flesh and bone, they were shadows given form, nightmares made flesh. But the elves were no ordinary foes. Their long lives had been spent honing skills that no mortal could hope to match. As the vampires surged forward, the Eldar responded with a fury born of desperation and pride. Silver blades, forged in the light of the two trees, glinted in the darkness, each strike accompanied by the ethereal glow of their wielder's strength. For every elf that fell, 2 vampires were struck down, their forms dissolving into ash with a hiss that seemed to echo with rage and pain. Yet, the vampires were cunning, and their strength lay not only in their ferocity but in their ability to inspire fear. They spoke in voices that slithered into the minds of their enemies, sowing doubt and despair. "You cannot stop us," they hissed. "Your light will fade, as all things do." Some elves faltered, their hands trembling as the weight of those words sank deep into their hearts. But others, hardened by centuries of struggle, stood firm, their voices rising in defiance. Songs of courage and hope filled the air, weaving a shield of sound that the vampires could not penetrate. When the battle ended, the ground was littered with the remains of both elf and vampire. The surviving Eldar knelt beside their fallen, their faces etched with sorrow and exhaustion. They whispered prayers to Eru Iluvatar, seeking solace for the lives lost and strength for the battles to come. Among the bodies, the vampires' ash mingled with the blood of the Eldar, a grim reminder of the price paid for survival. The elven lorekeepers, who had witnessed the carnage, took it upon themselves to record what had transpired. By the light of flickering lamps, they wrote of the creatures that had emerged from the shadows, detailing every chilling encounter. Their quills scratched against parchment as they described the vampires' speed, their claws, their insatiable hunger. They wrote of the unnatural cold that followed them, a chill that seemed to seep into the very soul. But they also wrote of their weaknesses, the way their flesh recoiled from the light of Aenir, the way their forms crumbled under the touch of enchanted blades. The lorekeepers did not shy away from the horrors they had witnessed. They painted vivid pictures of the vampires' attacks, their words imbued with the pain and terror that still lingered in their hearts. But they also wrote of the elves' resilience, their refusal to succumb to the darkness that sought to consume them. In their chronicles, the vampires were not just enemies, they were a reminder of the fragility of hope and the strength required to protect it. As the years passed, the tales of those battles spread among the Eldar, becoming part of their collective memory. Parents told their children of the vampires, warning them to stay close to the light and never stray too far into the shadows. Warriors trained with a renewed sense of purpose, their movements guided by the lessons learned in those fateful encounters. But the shadow of that night never truly lifted. The elves knew that the vampires were still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the moment to strike again. And so, even as they celebrated their victories and mourned their losses, they kept their weapons close and their hearts guarded. For they understood that the fight was far from over and that the darkness had many faces yet to reveal. The forest was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that makes every heartbeat feel like a thunderclap. Luthien's breath was steady, but her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of her cloak, its magic shimmering faintly in the dim moonlight. Beside her, Byrne crouched low, his gaze fixed ahead, his fingers brushing the hilt of his dagger. They were close, too close to retreat, too far to hope for safety. Somewhere in the oppressive darkness, something stirred. Thuringwethil, Morgoth's vampiric messenger, was more shadow than substance. Her wings, vast and leathery, blended into the night, making her seem like a fragment of the abyss itself. Her presence was not just felt, it pressed down, heavy and suffocating, as though the air itself recoiled from her. She carried the scent of death, a foul miasma that turned even the bravest hearts cold. As she moved, her talons scraped against the stone with a sound that set teeth on edge. Byrne had heard of her, the bringer of dread who carried Morgoth's commands across the darkened lands. He knew they would not survive a direct confrontation. Luthien, however, radiated a quiet determination that seemed to push back against the encroaching despair. Her voice, soft but unyielding, was a lifeline in the darkness. "Trust me," she whispered, her words like a balm to his fraying nerves. "She may be powerful, but even the greatest shadows have their flaws." Their plan was as reckless as it was desperate. Luthien's magic, woven into her cloak, was their only chance to deceive Thuringwethil. As the vampire approached, her wings rustling like dry leaves, Byrne felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He tightened his grip on his weapon, though he knew it would do little against a creature of such dark power. Thuringwethil's voice, when it came, was a low hiss, each word laced with malice. "You cannot hide from me," she said, her eyes gleaming like twin embers in the dark. "I smell your fear. I taste your desperation." She paused, her gaze sweeping the shadows as though she could peel them back with her will alone. "Come out, little ones. Let us end this charade." Luthien stepped forward, her movements fluid and deliberate. The cloak draped over her shimmered faintly, its magic masking her true form. Thuringwethil hesitated, her head tilting as she steadied the figure before her. "Who are you to stand before me?" the vampire demanded, her voice sharp and cutting. Luthien didn't answer. Instead, she began to sing. Her voice was soft at first, a melody that seemed almost fragile in the oppressive darkness. But as the song grew, so too did its power. The notes wove through the air like a tapestry, each one a thread of light in the consuming shadow. Thuringwethil faltered, her confidence wavering as the magic of the song wrapped around her. She hissed, her wings flaring as she tried to shake off the enchantment. Byrne seized the moment. Moving with the speed and precision of desperation, he lunged forward, his dagger aimed at the vampire's heart. Thuringwethil turned, her eyes blazing with fury, but Luthien's song held her, binding her movements just enough to give Byrne a chance. The dagger struck true, plunging into the creature's chest. Thuringwethil screamed, a sound that tore through the night like a physical force. Her body convulsed, the shadows around her writhing as though they, too, were in pain. For a moment, it seemed as though she might overpower them, her fury burning brighter than their resolve. But Luthien's song didn't falter. She sang with a strength that belied her small frame, her voice a beacon of hope in the suffocating dark. The light of her magic clashed with Thuringwethil's shadows, the two forces battling for dominance. Finally, with a final, shuddering gasp, Thuringwethil fell. Her body crumbled, dissolving into ash that was carried away by an unnatural wind. The silence that followed was deafening, a void left in the wake of her destruction. Byrne and Luthien stood there, their breathing ragged, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. The air around them felt lighter, as though the weight of Thuringwethil's presence had been lifted. But the victory was not without cost. Byrne's hand, slick with blood, some of it his own, shook as he sheathed his dagger. Luthien reached for him, her touch gentle but firm, grounding him in the reality of their survival. "We're not finished," she said softly, her voice steady despite the weariness etched into her features. "There's still so much more to face." And so they moved forward, their steps uncertain but their resolve unshaken, the memory of Thuringwethil's fall a reminder of what they were fighting for and what they stood to lose. The air was thick with the stench of burning earth and bitter despair. The sky, choked with smoke, reflected the fiery chaos below. Thuringwethil, Morgoth's towering fortress, loomed like a wounded beast, its once unshakable silhouette now fractured and bleeding darkness. The war of wrath raged, an unrelenting tide of vengeance brought by the Vala and their hosts. Beneath that storm of light and fury, Morgoth's servants fought with a ferocity born of desperation, none more so than the vampires. The shadows writhed with unnatural life as the creatures emerged, their forms flickering between tangible and spectral. These were no mere beasts. They were the dark whispers of Morgoth's will-made flesh, creatures forged to embody fear and destruction. Among them, Thuringwethil's kin still held their dreadful purpose, though the fall of their sister had left a scar even in their cold hearts. They circled the battlefield like vultures, their wings cutting through the smoke with an eerie grace. The armies of the Vala pressed forward, their banners glowing like beacons of hope against the gloom. Their chants and battle cries filled the air, each note a reminder that Morgoth's reign was nearing its end. The vampires descended in response, their screams piercing and otherworldly, a sound that gnawed at courage and planted seeds of doubt in even the mightiest warriors. In the chaos, one vampire, larger and darker than the rest, led the charge. Its talons gleamed like obsidian, its eyes burning with an unnatural fire. It dove into the ranks of the Vala soldiers with savage precision, scattering them like leaves in a gale. Yet, for all its strength, there was a weariness in its movements, a desperation that betrayed the crumbling foundations of its master's power. The vampires were not built for open war. They thrived in the shadows, in ambushes and terror. Here, in the blazing light of the Vala's wrath, they were outmatched. Still, they fought with an unyielding tenacity, their loyalty to Morgoth woven into the very essence of their being. They struck from the edges of the battle, slipping through cracks in the defenses, spreading fear where they could not claim victory. One warrior, a captain of the Eldar, found himself face to face with a vampire in the midst of the fray. Its form was monstrous, its wings stretching wide enough to blot out the light. For a moment, he faltered, his sword heavy in his hand. The creature seized the hesitation, lunging with a feral roar. But the captain's resolve hardened in the face of death, and he met the charge with a cry of his own, his blade slicing through the vampire's wing. The creature shrieked, its form flickering like a dying flame before it vanished into the shadows. Elsewhere, a group of dwarves held their ground against another vampire. Their axes rose and fell with brutal efficiency, each strike a testament to their unyielding spirit. The vampire lashed out, its claws raking through armor, but the dwarves did not retreat. They fought with the stubborn resilience of their kind, their voices rising in defiant song as they drove the creature back. In the end, it fell, its body dissolving into ash that was carried away on the wind. For every vampire that fell, another seemed to rise, their numbers seemingly endless. Yet, the tide was turning. The light of the Vala pressed harder, burning through the shadows, revealing the cracks in Morgoth's defenses. The vampires, for all their cunning and terror, could not stem the flood. Their strikes became more erratic, their movements less coordinated. They were fighting not just against their enemies, but against the inevitability of their own defeat. Within the fortress itself, the remaining vampires gathered in the halls of Thuringwethil. The air was heavy with dread, the walls trembling under the weight of the assault. Morgoth's voice, once commanding and absolute, now wavered with fury and fear. He ordered his servants to the front lines, demanded that they hold the tide, but even his words could not mask the truth. His empire was crumbling, and with it, his hold over the creatures he had bent to his will. The vampires, creatures of shadow and fear, had no place in the light of the new dawn that was rising. Their strength was fading, their very existence unraveling as Morgoth's power waned. Yet, they fought on, clinging to the only purpose they had ever known. They were the last, desperate threads of a tapestry being torn apart, and they refused to let go without a fight. As the final assault began, the vampires threw themselves into the fray with reckless abandon. They tore through the ranks of their enemies, their screams mingling with the clash of steel and the roar of fire. They were terrifying in their fury, but the light was relentless. One by one, they fell, their forms disintegrating into nothingness as the weight of the Vala's wrath bore down upon them. And then, as the walls of Thangorodrim began to crumble, the last of the vampires vanished into the smoke. Whether they were destroyed or fled into the shadows, none could say. Their presence lingered in the air, a haunting echo of the darkness that had once ruled. But even that, like all shadows, began to fade. The silence that followed Morgoth's fall was a kind of death itself. The world, still smoldering from the war, seemed to hold its breath. The Vala's victory echoed in the skies, but the earth below was an empty, desolate wasteland, devoid of the dark power that had once ruled it. Morgoth's presence, like a looming shadow, had vanished. And with it, so too did his creations. The vampires, those twisted, forsaken creatures, were left to wander in the wake of their master's destruction. For the first time in their existence, they were free. But freedom, to these broken souls, was not a blessing. It was a curse. Without Morgoth's will to guide them, they were adrift, ghosts without purpose, searching for meaning in a world that had cast them aside. The vampires who survived the fall of Thangorodrim, who had once fought with such fierce loyalty to their dark master, now found themselves alone in the shadows. Their bodies, made for war and darkness, seemed out of place in the quiet world that followed Morgoth's defeat. The lands were not their own anymore, not as they once were. No longer could they roam the battlefield with impunity. No longer could they feed off the terror they had sown. The world had changed, and they were no longer its kings. They were its forgotten. In the forests, the ancient trees whispered their names with sorrow, and the stars above shone down on them with pity. These creatures, once proud and powerful, now lurked in the dark corners of the world, hidden from sight. They lived in the cracks of civilization, blending into the shadows where they were little more than rumors, half-remembered nightmares told around campfires. Some retreated into the deepest caves, where the light could never touch them. In the darkness, they tried to rebuild what they had lost, but the silence was deafening. They had been made for conquest, for dominance, and now they were mere remnants of a broken empire. With no lord to serve, no battle to fight, the days became long and hollow. They hunted, not for sustenance, but for something they couldn't name. Some of them turned on each other, seeking the comfort of old, familiar horrors. Others, too proud to abandon their nature entirely, tried to impose themselves on those who remained in the world, trying to claim what they had once lost. But the world had moved on, and no one feared them anymore. In the cities, in the towns, in the places where the sun touched, the vampires were hunted, not as monsters, but as relics. The people did not remember the horror they had once wrought. The stories of vampires, once whispered in fear, were now mere folk tales, lost to time. But still, there were those who had seen them, who had heard the stories passed down through generations, and they knew the vampires were still there, lurking, waiting, hungry. Those few who could no longer bear the weight of their isolation tried to find solace in the things that had once defined them, blood. But it no longer tasted the same. The hunger gnawed at them, but it was not the same insatiable thirst for power, for control, that had driven them before. It was a hunger for meaning, for something to fill the void left by their fallen master. They fed on the living, yes, but with every bite, it felt emptier. The blood no longer burned with the power of Morgoth. It tasted of dust, of decay, of something forgotten. It was no longer about the hunt, but about survival. They were no longer creatures of purpose. They were just creatures. In the deepest parts of the world, in the darkest corners of the forgotten lands, there were those who sought to rebuild. They tried to gather the scattered remnants of their kin, to form a new order. But the truth was, they had no idea what that order would look like. What could a vampire, a creature born from darkness, become without its master? What could they hope to build when their entire existence had been defined by destruction? And so, they faded. They faded into the shadows, not with the pride of warriors, but with the resignation of the broken. They became ghosts of the past, haunting the edges of a world that had moved on without them. No longer feared, no longer revered, they were just there. The land began to forget them. The world moved forward. The elves rebuilt their kingdoms, the men forged their futures, and even the dwarves, those stubborn, unyielding folk, carried on their work in the deep halls of the mountains. But the vampires? They were forgotten, left to rot in the corners of the world. Some whispered that the vampires still lived in the deepest, most isolated parts of the world. They spoke of the abandoned cities, the forgotten forests, where the night grew long and cold. They said the vampires watched from the shadows, forever mourning the loss of their master, forever searching for a purpose they could never find. But most, as the years passed, came to believe the vampires were nothing but legends. After all, who could have believed that such creatures, such pure evil, could ever have existed? Who could have believed that the monsters of the past still walked the earth? And so, the vampires faded. They faded into the shadows, where no one could see them. And in that quiet, cold dark, they waited. They waited for something, anything, to stir them from the nothingness they had become. Because, in the end, they were still creatures of hunger. But now, it was not for power. It was for a world that no longer needed them. The Second Age brought a glimmer of hope to the world, but beneath the surface, the shadows of the past lingered. It was a time of great kings, of great cities rising from the sea, and yet, a darkness that had never fully been banished stirred in forgotten places. The vampire's curse, birthed from Morgoth's twisted creations, was still present, like a sickly stain that would not wash away, a whisper in the corners of the world. It wasn't always visible, but it was felt, like a cold hand on the back of your neck when no one was around. In the bustling cities of Numenor, with its towering buildings and grand ships, the stories were whispered in the dark alleys, told in hushed voices by the elders. Of pale, bloodthirsty creatures who were not fully dead, but not fully alive either. The tales were old, passed down through generations, but they still carried a weight, a chill, as though the nightmares they described had a life of their own. It was said that these creatures were born from Morgoth's malice, twisted into forms that could walk in the daylight but thrived in the night. But what was most terrifying, what made the stories truly horrible, was the idea that they could come for you, not just to kill, but to drag your soul into the darkness, leaving nothing behind but an empty shell. The people of Numenor dismissed these tales as superstition, a holdover from a time long past. Yet, even they could not escape the strange and unsettling dreams that would sometimes grip their nights, dreams of cold hands on their throats, of pale eyes staring from the shadows. Some say it was the curse of the vampires still alive in the world, others believed it was the shadow of Morgoth's lingering will, trying to reach through the ages, trying to reclaim what had been lost. In the forests, the stories spread too. The elves, those ancient and wise beings, spoke little of vampires, but when they did, their voices carried a certain sadness, a wariness. They knew that these creatures were not just mindless monsters, but tragic remnants of a long-dead power. They had seen the destruction they had wrought in ages past, and they feared that the curse of Morgoth still had the power to corrupt, to twist. Elven children were warned to stay away from the deep forests at night, where shadows seemed to move and strange whispers filled the air. The older elves, who had lived through the darkness of the First Age, would speak with a bitterness that only the weight of centuries could bring, saying that though Morgoth had fallen, his creations had endured, spreading their poison in quiet corners of the world. As Sauron rose to power in the Second Age, the fear of the vampires returned. Sauron, too, had once served Morgoth, and while his ambitions were different, his methods were not. It was said that in the blackest of nights, when the darkness felt suffocating and thick, Sauron would summon the remnants of Morgoth's creations. The vampires who had once fought for their master's dominion were now scattered, but still, some of them found themselves under Sauron's sway, their cursed thirst for blood turned to a new master. They lingered in the shadows of his armies, creatures with no true purpose, only the hollow desire to feed and serve. No one knew for certain how many vampires were still alive, or how many were now enslaved by Sauron's will. But there were whispers that the Black Númenóreans, those dark, twisted followers of Sauron, had made their own dark pacts, binding themselves to the old evil in ways that were never fully understood. Some say that it was the Black Númenóreans who kept the vampires alive, nurturing the old curse, feeding their hunger in exchange for their loyalty. Whether this was true or not, the thought of such a pact sent a shiver down the spine of any who heard it. What was worse than the vampires themselves was the way they seemed to slip through the cracks of the world. They were no longer the powerful force they once had been, but they didn't need to be. Their very existence, hidden in plain sight, lingering in forgotten places, was enough to stir terror in the hearts of the living. They were the monsters in the stories that children were told to fear. But now, there was no one to tell them to go away. The worst part, the most chilling aspect of all, was the feeling that they were always watching, waiting. The vampires had always been creatures of the night, but now, they had learned to hide in the shadows of the world. In the dark alleys of cities, in the remote corners of forests, and places where no one thought to look, they waited. They were no longer the force of chaos and destruction they had once been, but their presence was like a sickness, quietly infecting everything it touched. Their myth lived on, however, in the whispered legends. Some said that on moonless nights, you could hear their footsteps, soft as velvet, just behind you. Others spoke of strange figures who seemed to move just outside of the light, their eyes gleaming in the dark. There were tales of travelers who disappeared without a trace, of families who awoke to find their homes empty, the silence deafening. No one could prove these things, but the stories persisted, as if the world itself couldn't let go of the vampire's dark legacy. And even more unsettling was the idea that somewhere, far beyond the reach of the kingdoms of men, beyond the eyes of the elves, the vampires might still be gathering. Perhaps not for war, but for something darker, something that went beyond mere bloodlust. The lingering influence of Morgoth's creations was still felt, like a shadow cast over everything that came after. The question that no one dared ask was simple: what would happen when the vampires finally rose again? Would they return as they once were, fierce and unstoppable, ready to bring destruction upon the world? Or would they remain in the shadows, a hidden curse, waiting to strike when the world had forgotten them? The fear of the unknown haunted every whispered tale. And with every tale, the vampire's curse grew stronger, their presence more real, until one could not help but wonder if they were ever truly gone at all. The torches flickered in the oppressive silence of Sauron's fortress, their light barely touching the edges of the darkened chamber. The air was thick, not just with the smell of sulfur and ash, but with a palpable tension, a feeling that something unnatural was being drawn forth from the depths of existence. It was in such places that whispers said Sauron worked his foulest sorcery. Among his many obsessions, one lingered like a festering wound in the stories of those who feared him most, the vampires. Sauron was no mere disciple of Morgoth, he was a master in his own right, and where Morgoth's wrath had been wild and consuming, Sauron's was cold, calculating, and insidious. He did not simply wish to harness the creations of his fallen master, he sought to perfect them. Vampires had been among Morgoth's most feared servants, and though their numbers had dwindled since his defeat, Sauron's ambition reached into the void to rekindle their dark flame. In the shadows of his dark experiments, it is said he sought to take the remnants of those creatures and forge them anew. But Sauron did not just want to resurrect the vampires, he wanted them to become something more, something even more terrifying. Some say he hunted down the last of Morgoth's original creations, dragging them into his dungeons to subject them to his vile experiments. Others whispered that he bred new monstrosities, creatures that bore the hallmarks of vampiric hunger but were laced with Sauron's own cruel designs. The stories that emerged from those dark days were filled with horror, and though few could say they had seen the results of Sauron's work, the rumors were enough to inspire dread. Travelers spoke of creatures that moved too quickly to be seen clearly, shadows with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the soul. These were not the vampires of old, who prowled the night with hunger and malice. These were new horrors, twisted further by Sauron's hand. They were said to be stronger, faster, and crueler, driven not just by bloodlust but by a singular purpose, to serve their master with an unrelenting loyalty. One tale tells of a small village that vanished in a single night, leaving behind no bodies, only the faint smell of decay and an eerie stillness that stretched for miles. Those brave enough to investigate found claw marks in the stone walls, as if something impossibly strong had torn through them with ease. The villagers' possessions were untouched, their fires still smoldering, but there was no sign of life. Some believed the village had been taken as part of Sauron's experiments, its inhabitants twisted into his new breed of creatures. Others thought it was merely a warning, a demonstration of what his creations could do. The fear of these vampire-like creatures was not limited to remote villages. Even among the high halls of Numenor, the whispers of Sauron's experiments reached the ears of kings and scholars. Some dismissed them as mere legends, stories concocted to stoke fear of the Dark Lord. But others, those who had studied the histories of Morgoth's reign and the creatures he had unleashed, knew better. They saw the pattern, the signs that Sauron was not content with simply ruling through force and fear. He wanted to reshape the world, to infest it with his will, and these creatures were part of that design. Elves who had lived through the First Age and had fought against Morgoth's forces spoke of an uncanny familiarity in the descriptions of Sauron's creations. They remembered the terror of facing vampires on the battlefield, those pale, winged horrors that struck from the shadows and left nothing but death in their wake. Now, those memories were stirring again, and the elves who still walked the lands warned of a darkness that was growing stronger. They spoke of creatures that seemed to melt into the night, only to reappear where they were least expected. Of eyes that glowed red in the darkness, not with the wild hunger of the old vampires, but with a cold, calculating malice that was all too familiar. One chilling account came from a group of Númenórean sailors who had ventured too far into the uncharted waters near Sauron's domain. Their ship returned, battered and broken, but of the crew, only a single man survived. He spoke of shadows that moved like water, creeping across the deck despite the absence of light. He described a figure, pale and gaunt, with eyes that burned like coals and teeth that gleamed like daggers. The creature did not speak, but its presence filled the air with an overwhelming sense of despair. The sailor claimed it had taken the rest of the crew, dragging them into the depths one by one. His story was dismissed by most as the ravings of a man driven mad by fear, but those who had seen the darkness in the world knew better. Sauron's experiments were not just about creating weapons, they were about creating fear. The creatures he unleashed were as much psychological tools as they were physical ones. They were designed to haunt the minds of those who opposed him, to make them question every shadow, every whisper in the dark. Even those who never encountered the creatures directly were affected by the mere thought of them. The fear spread like a plague, weakening the resolve of Sauron's enemies before they ever set foot on the battlefield. Yet, for all their power and terror, there was something undeniably tragic about these creatures. They were not just monsters, they were victims, twisted by forces beyond their control. They had once been people, or elves, or perhaps something else entirely. Whatever they had been, they were no longer. They were hollow shells, filled only with the darkness that Sauron had poured into them. And perhaps that was the greatest horror of all, that they were not just creatures of the night, but living reminders of how far Sauron was willing to go in his quest for domination. The fear of these vampire-like creations lingered long after the Second Age. Even as Sauron's power was challenged and his forces were driven back, the memory of those creatures remained, a shadow that could not be banished. And as the world moved on, as new evils rose and fell, the question lingered, were Sauron's creations truly destroyed, or were they still out there, waiting for their moment to return? The moon hung heavy in the sky, its pale glow casting long, jagged shadows over the desolate ruins. The winds carried whispers, soft and fleeting, as though even the air itself feared to linger. Somewhere in the depths of Middle-earth, where light had long since forgotten to shine, a faint movement stirred in the darkness. It was not the rush of wind or the scurrying of creatures, but something quieter, more deliberate, a presence that sought to hide rather than be found. In the wake of Númenor's destruction, the balance of the world shifted violently, and the vampires of old, Morgoth's cursed creations, reshaped and wielded by Sauron, were among those who bore the weight of change. Once they had prowled the night with unchecked arrogance, shadows that no light could banish, creatures whose very names inspired fear. Now, they were hunted, despised, and fading into obscurity, their numbers dwindling with every passing age. The fall of Númenor had torn the world apart, and with it, the Nightkind lost the dark patronage that had sheltered them. Sauron's power had been shattered, and though his malice endured, it no longer burned brightly enough to sustain them. The vampires, creatures tied so deeply to his will, found themselves severed, like puppets with strings abruptly cut. It was as though the world itself had turned against them. The men of the West, emboldened by Sauron's seeming defeat, sought to purge the land of every lingering shadow. The vampires, once revered as unstoppable predators, became prey. Great hunts were organized, and the skies of Middle-earth were alight with flames as villages and towns came together to drive the creatures from their dens. Spears, torches, and silver were the tools of the hunters, and their chants echoed through forests and mountains, a war cry against the lingering darkness. For the vampires, survival became a torment. Where once they had roamed freely, now they crept through forgotten tunnels and abandoned ruins, their hunger gnawing at them like a constant ache. They became ghosts of their former selves, their proud wings folded against bodies made frail by despair. Each breath they took seemed a mockery, a cruel reminder of the life they could no longer claim as their own. Some found refuge in the furthest corners of Middle-earth, places untouched by the hands of men or elves. Deep within the shadowed forests of Mirkwood or the cold, silent caves beneath the misty mountains, they lingered, clinging to existence. These were not the lairs of majestic predators, but the hiding places of creatures too weary to fight, too broken to flee further. They whispered among themselves in voices trembling with fear and sorrow, wondering if they would be the last of their kind. But even in hiding, their presence was felt. Farmers would wake to find their livestock drained of blood, their fields silent in the eerie stillness of the morning. Travelers spoke of fleeting figures in the darkness, eyes that burned like coals watching from the tree-line. And then there were the stories, the chilling tales passed down by those who claimed to have encountered the night kind and lived to tell of it. These tales spread like wildfire, stoking the flames of fear and ensuring that the vampires would find no sanctuary among the living. For the elves, who had fought Morgoth's forces and remembered the first vampires, these creatures were not forgotten relics, but reminders of a world they had hoped to leave behind. Yet even the elves, with their wisdom and long memories, did not seek to destroy the vampires outright. Some said it was pity that stayed their hands, a recognition of the suffering that came with the curse. Others believed it was fear, not of the vampires themselves, but of what their destruction might unleash. For to eradicate them entirely would be to snuff out one of the last remnants of Morgoth's will, and none could say what darkness might rise in its place. Among men, the vampires became legends, woven into the fabric of myth and folklore. In some tales, they were monsters, merciless hunters that stole children in the night. In others, they were tragic figures, cursed to an existence of endless hunger and loneliness. One story told of a young woman who ventured into the woods to find the source of strange cries. There, she found a creature with pale skin and hollow eyes, its body trembling with weakness. The creature begged her for mercy, its voice barely above a whisper. She gave it a flask of wine and a piece of bread, and in return, it spared her life. But when she returned to the village to speak of what she had seen, no one believed her, and she was cast out as a liar and a fool. Such tales spoke to the complex nature of the night kind, creatures who were both victims and villains, both feared and mourned. They were not like the orcs or trolls, mindless tools of destruction. There was something deeper, something that struck at the heart of what it meant to be alive. For what was a vampire, if not a twisted reflection of humanity itself, a being trapped between life and death, hunger and despair, existence and extinction? The vampires of this age were no longer the proud warriors of Morgoth's armies or the cunning servants of Sauron's schemes. They were relics, fragments of a world that was slipping away. And yet, they endured. Even as their numbers faded and their power waned, they clung to the shadows, stubbornly refusing to vanish entirely. Some said it was their curse that kept them bound to the world, unable to find peace in death. Others believed it was something else, a spark of defiance, a refusal to let the light extinguish them completely. But in the quiet corners of Middle-earth, where the wind whispered through ancient trees and the stars shone cold and distant, the vampires waited. Perhaps they hoped for a time when the world would forget them, when the hunters would lay down their weapons, and they could emerge once more. Or perhaps they knew that their end was inevitable and were simply waiting for the darkness to claim them. And yet, there were whispers of something stirring in the forgotten places of the world. The forest was unnervingly quiet, as if even the trees held their breath. Beneath the heavy canopy of Mirkwood, shadows danced like living things, twisting and curling as though imbued with a will of their own. The faint rustle of leaves brought a fleeting moment of hope, but it quickly dissolved into unease. Something, or someone, was watching. The air felt heavy, thick with an unseen weight that pressed against the chest, making it hard to breathe. It wasn't just the darkness, it was the sensation of being hunted. Stories of strange encounters filtered out of the remote corners of Middle-earth, whispered in hushed tones by travelers who claimed to have escaped with their lives. These tales wove a chilling tapestry of sightings and hauntings, many connected to the lingering remnants of Morgoth's ancient curse. While the great battles of the Third Age raged, and Sauron's shadow stretched far and wide, there were other, quieter terrors, hidden within the folds of Mirkwood, Angmar, and beyond. Among the most haunting stories were those of lone wanderers who ventured too far into the forest and stumbled upon things they couldn't explain. One tale spoke of a young man traveling northward, his path taking him perilously close to the edges of Angmar. He claimed to have seen a figure standing in the mist, a pale, emaciated creature with glowing eyes that pierced the gloom like twin beacons. At first, he thought it was an illusion, some trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion. But then it moved. Its lips curled back to reveal jagged teeth, and it stepped forward with a predatory grace that froze him in place. He fled, but the sensation of its gaze stayed with him for days, as if it had marked him. When he returned to his village, his hair had turned stark white, and he spoke only in broken fragments. They found him weeks later, lifeless in his bed, 2 puncture marks on his neck the only clue to his demise. In Mirkwood, where darkness reigned even under daylight, the woods seemed to hold onto secrets with a sinister fervor. Hunters spoke of eerie cries that echoed through the trees, cries that sounded almost human but carried an edge of pain and hunger. One legend told of a group of elves who, during a patrol, found an abandoned campsite. The fire was cold, the supplies untouched, but the ground was stained with blood. As they searched, they found no bodies, only scraps of torn fabric and claw marks gouged into the trunks of trees. That night, under the pale moon, one of their own vanished, his disappearance marked by a single, strangled scream. Such encounters fed the belief that vampires, or beings like them, still haunted the shadows. Some said they were the descendants of Morgoth's original creations, warped and weakened by the ages, but no less dangerous. Others believed they were failed experiments of Sauron, cast out into the wilderness when they proved uncontrollable. Whatever the truth, they were creatures of hunger, driven by a need that was as consuming as it was terrifying. Even the bravest warriors tread cautiously when passing near Angmar, for the land itself seemed cursed. The Witch King's domain had always been a place of dread, but some whispered that it was not only wraiths who lingered there. Stories emerged of travelers who had ventured into the ruins of Carn Dum and never returned. Those who dared to speak of it claimed that figures moved in the shadows of the crumbling towers, figures with pale skin and eyes that glowed with a malevolent light. One account told of a merchant who passed through the area under the light of a full moon. He described seeing a woman standing atop a distant hill, her long hair flowing in the wind. She appeared to be singing, though the sound was faint and carried an eerie, mournful tone. As he watched, she turned to him, and her face, though beautiful, was a mask of sorrow and hunger. He fled, but her song stayed with him, haunting his dreams. The fear of these creatures was not confined to the wilderness. Even in the safer lands of men and elves, whispers of the night kind caused unease. Farmers in Eriador would occasionally find their livestock drained of blood, their bodies left untouched but for 2 small wounds. Mothers warned their children not to stray too far from home after dark, telling stories of creatures that could slip through the smallest cracks to find their prey. There were those who sought to dismiss these tales as mere superstition, the product of overactive imaginations in a time of war and fear. But others, especially those who had walked the shadowed paths of Mirkwood or the desolate reaches of Angmar, knew better. They had seen the signs, the inexplicable disappearances, the unnatural quiet, the feeling of eyes watching from the dark. What made these creatures so feared was not just their hunger but their silence. Unlike the orcs, who reveled in destruction, or the trolls, who bellowed and crashed through the forest, the vampires hunted with precision. They were shadows within shadows, their movements so subtle that they often passed unseen until it was too late. In a world already weighed down by the threat of Sauron and the devastation of war, the idea that another, older darkness still lingered was almost too much to bear. And yet, the stories continued to spread, gaining a life of their own. Perhaps it was the very act of telling these tales that kept the fear alive, a way for people to warn one another of dangers they barely understood. But not all stories ended in tragedy. There were whispers of those who had encountered the night kind and lived to tell the tale. Some claimed to have bargained with them, offering food or trinkets in exchange for their lives. Others said that these creatures, though cursed, retained a fragment of the beings they once were, a shred of mercy buried deep within their souls. As the Third Age wore on, the legends of these hauntings became woven into the fabric of Middle-earth, their shadows stretching long over the lands. Whether they were real or merely the echoes of an ancient fear, they reminded all who heard them that darkness had many forms, and some were too quiet to see until it was far too late. There was something unsettling about the ancient elven libraries, the weight of history pressing down like a forgotten memory. The long shelves, filled with scrolls and tomes, stretched far beyond what the eye could see. The quiet, cool air was thick with the knowledge of ages, the scent of parchment and ink hanging in every corner. Yet, in the silence, a faint chill lingered, as if something old, dark, and dangerous had once passed through these halls. It was here, among the words of elven scholars, that the truth about the vampires, those pale, haunted creatures, was preserved. In the far corners of these libraries, tucked between volumes of lore and songs of old, were writings that chronicled the dark presence of vampires. Not just as stories or myths, but as real, terrifying things that had once walked among the living. The elves, with their long lives and careful observations, had witnessed the horror of these creatures firsthand, and they knew all too well the dangers that lurked in the shadowed places of the world. The elven scholars wrote with a quiet precision, recording everything they could about these unnatural beings. They spoke not only of the physical characteristics of vampires, but of the darker symbolism that they represented. The creatures were not just monsters in the traditional sense. They were something deeper, something that embodied the fears and doubts of all who faced them. To the elves, vampires symbolized the corruption of life itself. Their insatiable hunger was not simply for blood, it was a hunger that tore at the very fabric of existence, consuming all that was pure and beautiful in the world. In the soft light of the elven cities, where songs of joy and celebration filled the air, the vampires represented the antithesis of everything the elves stood for: life, light, and harmony. These creatures were born of darkness, their existence an affront to the natural order. But the elves also knew that these creatures were once something more. They had been twisted and broken, their minds and bodies warped by an ancient, malevolent force. Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, had created them, and they had been his instruments of terror. But even after his fall, the remnants of his creation still clung to life in the dark corners of Middle-earth. It was as if the very memory of Morgoth's cruelty had been embedded in their beings, forever binding them to a fate of hunger and despair. Some of the elven writings described the vampires as creatures of shadow, moving through the world with a predatory grace. They were said to be beautiful, even captivating, but there was a darkness in their eyes, a cold, unfeeling emptiness that made even the bravest of elves shudder. They were creatures of night, with skin as pale as the moon and teeth sharp enough to pierce the strongest of defenses. But it was not just their physical appearance that made them terrifying. It was the fears they invoked, the way they seemed to prey on the very souls of those who crossed their path. One elven scholar, in a particularly somber passage, described the vampire's bite as more than just a wound. To him, it was a mark of damnation, a wound that not only drained the body but also consumed the spirit. The victim was left not just weakened but forever scarred, the memory of the encounter lingering in their mind like an unshakable nightmare. The elves spoke of the power these creatures held over the minds of mortals, the way they could weave illusions and bend wills to their own dark desires. Yet, as much as the elves feared these creatures, they also recognized the deep sorrow that lay within them. The vampires were not born of evil, they were made. They were the victims of a curse, twisted and malformed by a master who cared nothing for their suffering. In the elven writings, there was often a tone of mourning for these creatures, a sorrow that they could not escape the shadow of their past. They were, in many ways, victims of a history they could not control. And in that history, the elves saw a reflection of themselves, a reminder of what could happen when light and beauty were corrupted beyond recognition. The elves knew that the vampires were dangerous, that their presence in the world was a threat that could not be ignored. But they also understood that the creatures were not all-powerful. They were bound by their curse, trapped in a never-ending cycle of hunger and pain. They were not invincible, and the elves were careful to guard against them, to ensure that they remained in the shadows where they belonged. In some of the most ancient texts, there were references to ways the elves had found to protect themselves from the vampires. These methods were not often spoken of openly, for fear of attracting the attention of the creatures they sought to avoid. But among the elven scholars, there were rumors of hidden rites, ancient spells, and protections that could ward off the vampire's bite. These secrets were passed down only to the most trusted of scholars, those who had proven themselves capable of understanding the delicate balance between life and death. Despite the fear these creatures evoked, there was a sense of reverence in the elven writings. The vampires were not just monsters, they were reminders of the fragility of life, of the dark forces that could twist even the most beautiful of creations. The elves, in their wisdom, understood that darkness was not something to be destroyed, but something to be guarded against, kept at bay with knowledge and caution. Over the centuries, these writings became part of the elven heritage, a record of the things that had shaped their history, of the dangers they had faced, and of the lessons they had learned. As the ages passed and the world changed, the vampires faded into myth, their stories told in whispers, their names rarely spoken. But the elves knew better. They knew that the darkness was never truly gone. It only slumbered, waiting for the moment when it could rise again. Even in the farthest reaches of Middle-earth, the memory of the vampires lingered. In the quiet corners of the world, where few dared to go, the elven writings remained, a testament to the creatures that had once walked the earth. They were not just monsters, but symbols of warnings, reminders of the darkness that lay hidden just beyond the light. The wind whispered through the trees of the darkened forest, carrying with it an air of unease. The night was still, too still, as if the very earth held its breath. Fires flickered low in the villages of men, casting long shadows on the walls of their modest homes. Inside, stories were whispered, stories meant to keep children near and to remind adults of the dangers they dared not speak aloud. There were tales of pale figures with lifeless eyes, creatures that walked as though alive but carried the stench of death. Their names varied across lands, but their essence was always the same: hunters of the night, feeders on the lifeblood of the living. These stories were not born from simple imagination. They carried a weight, a shared terror rooted in something real, something ancient. The men of Middle-earth did not always know it, but these myths were echoes of Morgoth's creations, remnants of a shadow that had touched their world long ago. The vampires of Morgoth had left more than destruction in their wake. They had etched themselves into the hearts and minds of men, their horrors passed down through generations in whispered warnings and fevered dreams. In the villages of Eriador, they spoke of creatures that would come in the guise of a loved one, knocking softly at the door. If answered, it was said, the creature would step inside, its cold gaze locking onto its victim as it drained the life from their veins. In Gondor, the stories were different. Here, they told of shadowy figures seen near the riverbanks, figures whose reflections were absent from the waters. These beings were said to be bound by a curse, doomed to wander the world without the solace of death. No matter the region, the details were eerily similar, as if the stories had a shared origin. The vampires of Morgoth were not mere beasts, they were cruel, cunning, and terrifyingly human in their malice. Morgoth, in his hatred for all things pure, had twisted their forms and their spirits, creating predators that could mimic the living even as they feasted upon them. They were a perversion of life itself, and their presence lingered like a dark stain long after they had disappeared from the lands of men. It was not just fear that shaped these tales, it was the profound sense of helplessness that came with them. The stories spoke of victims lured by beauty or charm, only to find themselves ensnared by something they could not escape. There was an unspoken truth woven into these myths, a reminder that not all threats could be faced with sword and shield. The vampires preyed not just on blood but on trust, turning the familiar into a weapon against those who dared to let their guard down. Among the tales, there was one that haunted the people of Rohan. It spoke of a young warrior who had gone missing after venturing into the wold one moonless night. When he returned, he was changed, his once bright eyes dull and lifeless, his laughter replaced by an eerie silence. At first, his kin welcomed him back, relieved at his return. But then the livestock began to die, their throats torn open, their blood drained. It was only when the warrior's wife was found pale and lifeless in their bed that the truth became clear. The village elders gathered, their faces grim, and the young man was driven out, his cries echoing in the night. They never saw him again, but they spoke of him for years to come, warning their children to beware the shadows. These stories found their way into song and poem, their details shifting with each telling but their essence remaining the same. The Vampires of Morgoth became symbols of the unknown, the unseen dangers that lurk just beyond the firelight. In time, they became a part of the cultures of men, their stories woven into the fabric of daily life. Yet, for all the fear they inspired, there was also a strange fascination. The idea of a being that could defy death, that could live forever in the shadows, struck a chord in the hearts of men. It was a twisted sort of immortality, one that carried with it a terrible price. In the northern reaches of Angmar, the stories took on an even darker tone. Here, the vampires were said to be servants of the Witch King, hunting those who dared oppose his will. They were not solitary creatures, but part of a larger, more sinister force. The people of Angmar whispered of nights when the winds carried strange cries, sounds that sent shivers down the spines of even the bravest warriors. These tales were told with hushed voices, for to speak too openly of the vampires was to invite their attention. Despite the variations, there was a common thread running through all these stories, a sense of inevitability, of a darkness that could not be outrun. The vampires were not merely monsters, they were a reflection of the fears and uncertainties that plagued the hearts of men. They embodied the fragility of life, the ever-present shadow of death that loomed over all. Yet, they were also a reminder of resilience, of the strength it took to face the unknown and to carry on in spite of it. The myths of the vampires, though terrifying, were not without purpose. They served as warnings, as lessons passed down through generations. They taught vigilance, the importance of light in the face of darkness, and the value of community in standing against the threats that sought to divide and destroy. Even as the stories grew and changed, they remained a testament to the resilience of men and their refusal to succumb to despair. Still, there were those who wondered if the stories were more than mere myth. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world was shrouded in darkness, some swore they could feel eyes watching from the shadows. Others claimed to have seen figures moving in the periphery of their vision, disappearing the moment they turned to look. These accounts were often dismissed as the imaginings of a restless mind, but they left a lingering unease, a reminder that the shadows were never truly empty. The stories of the vampires did not end with the passing of time. They lived on, passed from parent to child, their details shifting but their essence unchanged. They were a part of the collective memory of men, a shadowy thread woven into the tapestry of their existence. Even as the world moved forward and new tales were told, the old stories remained, a whisper of the darkness that had once walked among them. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with an unspoken dread. It wasn't the kind of fear that came from a visible threat, but something deeper, something that whispered from the shadows. The forest stretched endlessly, its darkness broken only by faint glimmers of moonlight filtering through twisted branches. In that silence, the mind would wander, catching fleeting thoughts of things unseen. It was here, in the emptiness, that one could feel the pull, a soft, sinister lure that invited you to step closer, to trust the voice that wasn't your own. The Vampires of Morgoth were never just creatures of the night. They weren't merely monsters that fed on blood. They were symbols, dark and potent, their very existence a warning etched into the fabric of Middle-earth. To speak of them is to speak of the allure of corruption, the fragile line between light and shadow, and the way temptation sinks its claws into even the strongest hearts. They were Morgoth's shadowy whispers made flesh, a living embodiment of his hatred for everything good and pure. The first stories always spoke of their beauty. How could something so elegant, so alluring, hide such a monstrous core? But that was the trick, wasn't it? They were never meant to repulse, they were meant to entice. Morgoth created them to be hunters, but not with claws or fangs alone. Their true weapon was their ability to mirror the desires of their prey, to offer something irresistible. They were reflections of the soul's darkest longings, and in their presence, it became harder to hold onto the light. It wasn't just individuals they consumed, it was hope itself. The vampires symbolized the slow, creeping decay that begins in a single heart and spreads outward. They weren't like the orcs, who stormed into villages with fire and brute strength. No, they worked in whispers, in the corners of rooms, in the soft moments when vigilance faltered. They would find the crack in a person's resolve, the smallest seed of doubt, and they would nurture it until it blossomed into despair. Their victims weren't just left lifeless, they were left hollow. The people who feared them most weren't the bold warriors or the wise elders. It was the dreamers, the ones who carried fragile lights within their hearts. To these people, the vampires represented the loss of what they held most dear. A poet would tremble at the thought of his words turned into mockery. A mother would clutch her child tighter, fearing the day she couldn't protect what she loved most. The vampires were a shadow cast over hope itself, a reminder that even the brightest flame could falter. But why did Morgoth give them such form, such purpose? Perhaps it was because he understood the power of fear. In Tolkien's world, fear wasn't just a reaction, it was a force, one that could shape actions and even alter destinies. The vampires fed on more than blood, they fed on the fear of falling into darkness, on the silent understanding that the light wasn't guaranteed to last. They weren't just symbols of death, they were symbols of what it meant to lose yourself completely. Their stories often ended the same way, with silence. A family that was once whole left broken, a village emptied of its laughter. But the silence wasn't the absence of sound, it was the absence of light. It was the quiet that follows when a community realizes it has lost more than a life, it has lost its trust, its faith. Morgoth's creations didn't just kill, they left scars that lingered for generations. There was something profoundly unsettling about the way they moved, the way their shadows stretched too far, the way their eyes seemed to hold both promise and doom. They were the what-ifs of life made real. What if you failed? What if you gave in? What if the light wasn't strong enough to protect you? These creatures reminded everyone that even in a world filled with courage and valor, there was always a sliver of darkness waiting to creep in. And yet, their existence wasn't just a warning, it was a challenge. To face them was to face the very essence of temptation, the sweet lies that promised relief in exchange for the soul. Those who resisted, who stood firm even as the darkness pressed against them, were the true heroes of these tales. They weren't the ones with swords in hand or armor on their backs, they were the ones who carried their light forward, refusing to let it flicker out. The vampires symbolized what it meant to fight against despair, to hold on to something pure even when it seemed easier to let go. They were reminders that the true battle wasn't always against what stood before you, it was against what lived within. And that battle, as quiet and invisible as it might be, was one of the most important struggles in all of Middle-earth. Even now, the whispers of their presence linger. The stories may have faded, turned into myth and legend, but the fear they represented is timeless. There will always be shadows that stretch too far, promises too sweet to trust, and moments when the light feels just out of reach. And in those moments, one must remember that the darkness, no matter how vast, cannot erase the light entirely. The choice to resist, to fight for what is good, remains a power that no shadow can take away. The night was alive with whispers, an unsettling rhythm of breath and silence that seemed to come from the earth itself. Shadows stretched unnaturally, creeping over the jagged stones, each one carrying a sense of menace. But not all shadows were the same. Some merely lingered, formless and empty. Others felt alive, coiled with intent, waiting. There were creatures in this darkness, each one a piece of Morgoth's twisted legacy, but none so haunting as the vampires. Orcs were brutal and mindless instruments of chaos that left a trail of destruction in their wake. They howled their allegiance in the night and struck with a savage glee, driven by hatred that felt almost too simple. Wargs prowled with primal hunger, their eyes gleaming with an animalistic malice. They hunted in packs, their growls tearing through the silence like a blade. Dragons were different, majestic and terrifying, embodiments of greed and power that could raise entire kingdoms with a single breath. Yet even they were tethered to the earth in ways the vampires were not. The Vampires of Morgoth were something else entirely. They didn't rely on brute force or primal instinct. They were quiet, calculated, and precise. They didn't just destroy, they consumed. Where an orc would burn a home, a vampire would shatter its foundation, leaving behind a hollow shell of despair that could never quite heal. Their presence lingered long after they were gone, a shadow in the corners of the mind, a weight that could never be lifted. While dragons inspired awe and terror in equal measure, vampires operated in subtler ways. A dragon's fire was a declaration, an unmissable display of power that consumed everything in its path. Vampires, on the other hand, extinguished light one flicker at a time. Their approach wasn't a roaring inferno but a quiet snuffing out of hope. They crept into dreams, into fears, and into hearts, leaving behind a silence that screamed louder than any dragon's roar. Orcs and wargs were slaves to their natures, driven by instincts they could not control. Their rage was predictable, their violence almost reassuring in its simplicity. But the vampires didn't play by the same rules. They were deliberate, patient, and endlessly cunning. They chose their victims not for sustenance alone but for the impact their loss would create. A hero reduced to despair, a leader broken by doubt, a community torn apart by mistrust, these were the marks of a vampire's touch. Even among Morgoth's creatures, they stood apart, their very essence an affront to the natural order. Orcs and wargs, though monstrous, were living beings, their forms twisted but still recognizable. Dragons, for all their evil, were creatures of flesh and bone, tangible in their menace. But vampires blurred the line between life and death. They were not bound by the same laws as other beings. They moved through shadows as if they were part of them, their presence felt more than seen. It was this unnatural quality that made them so terrifying. They weren't just creatures of darkness, they were darkness. While orcs and dragons reveled in destruction, vampires thrived on corruption. They didn't need to destroy a kingdom to claim victory, they could dismantle it from within. Their power wasn't in their strength or their speed, but in their ability to turn even the purest heart against itself. They were mirrors of the soul's darkest desires, reflections of what one feared most to become. And in that reflection, they found their greatest weapon, the truth that every being carries shadows within. In Tolkien's world, darkness often had a purpose, a driving force behind its malice. Dragons were symbols of greed, their hordes a testament to their insatiable hunger for power. Orcs embodied the degradation of the noble, a tragic reminder of what could happen when the light was twisted beyond recognition. But vampires were different. They weren't just symbols of evil, they were echoes of choices left unmade, roads not taken, and the weight of regret. They were the embodiment of what it meant to lose oneself entirely, to give in to the whispering voice that promised relief at the cost of everything else. Unlike wargs, whose howls filled the night with dread, or orcs, whose battle cries signaled death, vampires left no such warnings. Their attacks weren't marked by sound or fury, but by silence, a silence that seeped into the bones, chilling and relentless. Where other creatures announced their presence with violence, vampires let their victims come to them, drawn by an unseen force they could neither name nor resist. Dragons were feared because of their sheer power, their ability to destroy cities and armies with ease. But vampires evoked a deeper fear, the fear of losing control, of becoming something you no longer recognized. They weren't just monsters, they were reminders of the fragility of the soul, of how easily the line between light and darkness could blur. And yet, for all their terror, there was a strange beauty to them. It was a beauty that repelled and entranced, that drew people closer even as it warned them away. Morgoth had crafted them not just to terrify but to seduce. There were sirens in the shadows, their voices soft and haunting, their promises sweet but laced with venom. They didn't need to chase their prey, they simply waited, knowing the light would falter eventually. The vampires stood as a testament to the idea that darkness wasn't always loud or brash. Sometimes it was quiet, creeping, and insidious. It was a shadow that stretched too far, a whisper that lingered too long, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. And in that stillness, that silence, they thrived. But even in the darkest of nights, there was always the faintest glimmer of light. It was a light that the vampires couldn't extinguish completely, no matter how hard they tried. That light, fragile yet unyielding, was the one thing they could never claim as their own. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying an eerie stillness that seemed to press against the soul. It wasn't the kind of quiet that brought peace, it was a silence that unsettled, a void that begged to be filled with answers that would never come. The stars above flickered like hesitant witnesses, and the moon's pale light seemed to hold its breath, as though afraid to touch the earth below. There was something wrong, something buried beneath the surface of the world, something that pulsed faintly in the blood of men. Legend spoke of Morgoth's vampires, their twisted forms and cruel appetites leaving scars on the histories of Middle-earth. But scars have a way of going unnoticed as they fade, even when they're still there. The thought was haunting. What if the blood of those creatures, tainted and dark, hadn't vanished entirely? What if it had seeped into the veins of the living, disguised beneath mortal faces, hidden in plain sight? There were those in Middle-earth who seemed different. A man whose shadow lingered too long after he walked away. A woman whose gaze seemed to pierce straight through to your soul, leaving you cold. They weren't monstrous, not in any obvious way, but there was something about them, something that didn't quite fit. Stories whispered of families that carried strange marks, not visible on their skin but felt in their presence, a heaviness that couldn't be explained. These were dismissed as mere superstitions, the ramblings of old folk with too much time to think. But what if they weren't? The idea of a vampiric bloodline wasn't entirely impossible. Morgoth's creations were cunning, and their influence was rarely straightforward. Perhaps some of his vampires had found ways to mingle with men, not out of love or desire, but out of strategy. A child born of such a union would look human, act human, and yet carry something other in their veins. A subtle strength, an unnatural grace, a hunger they couldn't quite name. They wouldn't need to drink blood or lurk in shadows, but their essence might carry the faint echo of the darkness that birthed them. What would it mean for someone to live with that kind of legacy? To feel the pull of something they didn't understand, to fear the thoughts that came unbidden in the quiet of the night? A boy might grow up feeling different, his heart heavy with a sadness he couldn't explain. A girl might notice how animals shied away from her touch, their instincts sensing what her mind refused to acknowledge. These hidden bloodlines, if they existed, would be a curse carried in silence, a burden no one would understand. And yet, curses have a way of spreading. A man with a shadow too long might marry a woman who saw too clearly, and their children might carry fragments of both. Over generations, the marks would blur, fade, and seem to disappear. But blood remembers. It holds onto its secrets, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. Perhaps a descendant would one day wake up with a dream they couldn't shake, a dream of teeth and shadows, of a voice calling them back to something they didn't recognize but somehow knew. The possibility of half-vampiric hybrids was terrifying, not because they would be monsters, but because they wouldn't. They would be human, or almost human, walking among the people of Middle-earth with their true nature hidden even from themselves. How many might have existed over the ages, blending in, their differences masked by the ordinary struggles of life? And how many might have succumbed to the whispers of their blood, the pull toward something darker, something that felt like home? There were stories, of course. A man who seemed to age slower than the seasons, his hair silvering but his face untouched by time. A child born with eyes that gleamed in the dark, her laughter sweet but unsettling. Villages whispered of strangers who arrived with the dusk and left before the dawn, leaving behind a sense of unease that lingered for days. These were dismissed as coincidences, strange but harmless. But were they? Some claimed that certain bloodlines carried curses, passed down from ancestors who had struck bargains with forces they didn't understand. These curses weren't always visible, but they shaped lives in quiet, insidious ways. A family plagued by misfortune, their fields failing year after year no matter how hard they worked. A lineage marked by tragedy, their loved ones always slipping away too soon. It was easy to write these off as bad luck, but bad luck has a way of feeling deliberate when it lasts long enough. If vampiric bloodlines did exist, they wouldn't just be a matter of heritage, they would be a reflection of choice. The choice to resist or to give in, to carry the weight of darkness or to let it consume you. Perhaps some descendants found ways to channel their unusual traits, using their heightened senses or uncanny intuition for good. Others might have succumbed, their hearts turning cold as they embraced the shadows within. But darkness doesn't always need to be embraced to spread. Sometimes it lingers, quiet and unnoticed, influencing in ways that are almost imperceptible. A family with vampiric ancestry might never know their origins, but they might feel it in the way their dreams grew darker, in the way their tempers flared too quickly, in the way their laughter sometimes felt hollow even to themselves. It wasn't their fault, and yet it was theirs to bear. The thought of such hidden bloodlines is chilling not because of what they might do, but because of what they might mean. That darkness isn't always an outside force, something you can fight or banish. Sometimes it's inside, woven into the very fabric of who you are. And if that's true, how do you fight it? How do you resist something that feels like a part of yourself? The moon was high now, its light stark and unyielding, casting sharp shadows that seemed to move just out of sight. The wind had stilled, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the world was holding its breath. Somewhere in that silence, there might be a man or a woman, a child or an elder, carrying within them the remnants of a story long forgotten. A story of shadows and whispers, of choices made and consequences born, of bloodlines that refused to fade. And as the night stretched on, one could only wonder, was it really forgotten, or was it just waiting? The air felt heavy, as if the world itself was reluctant to move forward. It wasn't the weight of a storm or the dread of an enemy approaching, it was the lingering imprint of something far older and darker, a shadow that had never truly lifted. Morgoth's hand, though severed from the world, still reached through the echoes of time, grasping at the hearts of those who dared to remember his creations. There was an unspoken truth in Middle-earth, a knowledge buried beneath tales of valor and triumph. The songs of the elves and the sagas of men spoke often of light, of victories hard-won and evils vanquished. But even in the brightest notes, there was a strain of sorrow, a whisper that reminded everyone of the shadow that had never fully gone away. Morgoth's legacy was not just in the lands he scorched or the lives he claimed, it was in the scars he left on the very fabric of existence. His creations were not simple monsters to be fought and forgotten. They were beings of malice and despair, creatures designed not just to destroy but to linger. Among them were the vampires, woven from shadow and hunger, their forms twisted into something that fed on fear as much as blood. They were not the most numerous of his spawn, nor the most powerful. But they were perhaps the most insidious. Where dragons roared and balrogs burned, the vampires crept, unseen and silent, leaving a trail of emptiness that was far harder to fight. Their presence was felt in places where the light seemed to falter, where joy turned hollow and hope withered on the vine. They did not need to kill to leave their mark. A single whispered word, a fleeting shadow in the corner of an eye, was enough to unsettle even the bravest heart. Their touch was cold, not with the chill of winter, but with the absence of warmth, a void that seemed to pull everything good into itself and leave nothing behind. In the broader mythos of Middle-earth, the vampires seemed almost like an afterthought, overshadowed by the grander evils that Morgoth unleashed. But their quiet menace was their power. They thrived in the cracks of the world, in the places where the light didn't reach, where the great heroes of legend rarely ventured. It wasn't that they were forgotten, it was that they were ignored, their threat dismissed because it wasn't as loud or obvious. And yet, wasn't that what made them so dangerous? That they could exist without being seen, their influence spreading like a shadow cast by nothing at all? The thought of them was enough to chill the blood. Not because they were monstrous, but because they were so achingly close to human. Their hunger, their despair, their longing for something they could never have, it was all too familiar. They were not creatures of pure malice like orcs or mindless destroyers like trolls. They were cunning, patient, and above all, tragic. They were the embodiment of what happened when light was taken away, when hope was stripped so thoroughly that all that remained was a hollow, endless thirst. To understand them was to see the balance of light and darkness in Middle-earth for what it truly was, fragile. The world was not a battle between opposites, but a delicate dance where one misstep could tip everything into shadow. The elves, with their immortal beauty and wisdom, carried the weight of countless sorrows, their joy always tempered by the knowledge of loss. Men, with their fleeting lives, burned bright but quickly, their hope often tinged with desperation. Even the Mayor, beings of immense power, were not immune to the pull of the void. Morgoth himself was proof of that, a being of light who had fallen so far that his very essence became darkness. And yet, there was always resistance. Not just in swords and shields, but in the quiet acts of defiance that went unnoticed by history. A single lamp lit in a darkened room. A song sung softly to ward off the silence. These were the things that kept the balance, the small flickers of light that refused to be extinguished. They were the reason Morgoth's creations, for all their power, had never completely taken the world. Because light, no matter how faint, had a way of persisting. Even the vampires, for all their cunning and hunger, could not completely escape that truth. There were tales, rare and quiet, but persistent, of those who had tried to resist their nature. Vampires who had chosen isolation over feeding, who had turned their backs on Morgoth's legacy even as it burned in their veins. It didn't make them heroes, and it didn't absolve them of the horrors they had committed. But it was a reminder that even in the darkest shadows, there was room for choice. The balance of light and darkness was not just a battle, it was a reflection of the world itself, of the hearts that beat within it. Morgoth's legacy was a heavy shadow, but it was not the only force at work. There was light, too, in the laughter of children, and the steadfastness of those who refused to give up, and the songs that rose even in the face of despair. It was fragile, yes, and easily overshadowed. But it was there. And it was enough. The night stretched on, the stars above shifting like distant, unblinking eyes. Somewhere in the depths of the world, where the light had not touched for centuries, the vampires remained. Waiting. Watching. But they were not the only ones. The light was there too, faint and flickering, but alive. And in the endless dance of shadow and flame, the story continued, its ending unwritten.